That. So Yaron mentioned that he and I have a book coming out, Equals Unfair. You can buy it right now just outside here on the economic inequality debate. And the way that this came about was it was June of 2014. And if you were following this at all, you'll remember that a French economist, Thomas Piketty, came out with a book that's about this big called Capital in the 21st Century that just became a blockbuster. In fact, I mean, it's still 2 years later in the top 1,000 on Amazon. And really took this idea that the left had been talking about for a long time, and President Obama had started talking about in 2013, but this really pushed it into the headlines and made it a central issue for the left. And if you looked at polling about what Americans thought about economic inequality, since 2013, 2014, you've seen them become more and more concerned about it. And Yaron was basically going on a nice little private rant for me in his office about if this issue, if this really gets to Americans, that's the end of the American sense of life. If we start resenting success, that it becomes hopeless. And I said, well, somebody better write a book about it. And then I paused and said, oh, Christ. So for those who don't know, Yaron and I wrote a book together a few years before that called Free Market Revolution. So we had worked together before, and he and I are basically the ones who focus on economic issues at the Institute. And so I just wanted to say a little bit about how we think about books, because we do think that social media is important, video is important, giving talks is important. At the end of the day, the thing that actually is going to change somebody's mind on any significant issue is going to be a book. But a book is a huge investment of time and of resources, and so you need to be very strategic. This is my third book, and I learned a lot about what kinds of considerations have to go into even choosing a book like this, because you're going to sink a lot of time into it, and if you don't get a big return on influence, then we're not doing our jobs right, and we're not spending your money right. And really there's three major questions that I think are critical with any book. So the first is it a high leverage issue? That is, if we actually make headway on this issue, does that move the ball forward in the game? We could change somebody's minds on some really minor point, right? But that does not get us a long way. So it needs to be an important issue, an issue that touches a number of other things, that has some fundamental philosophic firepower to it. The second is, do we have a distinctive message? And we often do, but you need to make sure that that's the case, because if you're just basically coming out and repeating something that other people are saying, even if it's true, well, why don't we just let them do it and focus on other things? So you want it to be high leverage, you want it to be distinctive to what we have to say. And then the third is there a market for the message? And this doesn't mean people who already agree, quite the contrary, right? But you want people who are open to persuasion and who are targetable. If they're just sprawled out across the United States and you can't identify them, or the world for that matter, you can't identify them and target them very well, then it doesn't do you any good to put out a book that's really persuasive and nobody reads it unless you have like a $10 million marketing campaign, which we can't quite do yet. Although if there's anybody in this room who wants to help, we will be more than happy to put together a $10 million marketing campaign. So in this particular case, it was very clear that in all three of these issues, this kind of book was going to be crucial and valuable. So is this a high leverage issue? Well, inequality is not just another issue. It's not like healthcare. Healthcare is an important issue, and I do think that's one place where we need to be fighting a tough battle. But economic inequality is actually the framework through which the left views every economic issue, including healthcare. So that's why they're so big on this issue, and it's why it's so important that we win on this issue, because if you accept the framework of thinking that gaps are evil, that success is something to be suspicious of, well, that's going to be very hard when you're saying, hey, we should all be free to succeed based on our ability, and people have very different levels of ability and therefore very different outcomes. So it is definitely a high leverage issue. What about a distinctive message? Well, I'll just point to the title. But more specifically, objectivism is the only approach and philosophy that views economic success and more broadly success and happiness as morally good. And this is a definite, explicitly moral issue. The left has made it a moral issue. It's an issue about fairness. It's an issue about justice. And so if our message is going to be that success is not just something that is good because it's going to lead to economic growth, but that it's morally good and therefore it's unfair to sacrifice the people who've achieved it, that is something people have never heard before. And that leads to number 3. Are there people who even want to hear or could be open to this message? Well, this is a very interesting place to be on the inequality debate. The left has been writing 10 roughly books a year, major books. I'm not even talking about academic books that nobody reads, but roughly 10 major books a year by journalists, intellectuals, commentators, academics, everybody in between, put out by major presses, arguing that this is a critical issue, that we need to fight inequality. How many books has there been opposing them? How many major books? Well, it turns out that at least by the time we started writing and talking about this book, there were 0. There's 0. Today, there's 2. One you've never heard of. It's by some Canadian professor, and it has actually some good points. And in fact, I'm pretty sure that I've sold more copies of it through me talking about it than even he has. And then another is by Thomas Sowell, and many of you might know him, and there's some good stuff there, but it's basically talking about the statistics, and it says they're wrong on statistics. And as I'm going to come to, that's just not good enough. It's good, and I'm glad that book is out there, but it's just not good enough. But in general, in marketing, it's a very good place to be in if there's not a lot of competition, and yet there's people out there who have a need that they are searching for an answer for. And it turns out that on this issue, most people on the right are convinced that they need an answer here, and they don't have one. And that makes it very easy to sell something. It's very hard to sell something to people where they don't have a perceived need, and you're trying to say, hey, you need this. You just don't know it. Or if they have a perceived need, but they think it's already fulfilled. What do I need you for? I've already got this taken care of. But when somebody has a perceived need that they don't think is being filled, you have a very high opportunity, a very big opportunity to target them and make a big impact. So this is why going in, we thought this book was so important. I want to flesh out just briefly what this book is trying to do now, given that it, I think, is the right book for our mission. So I mentioned earlier that the left has really been dominating this issue. It's really been winning this debate, and people, Americans who were historically not really concerned about economic inequality have become more and more concerned. And basically it comes down to they have 2 things going for them. 2 major things going for them. One is they've positioned themselves as fighting for a moral ideal, equality. We're on the side of equality. All right, great. When you have a moral ideal on your side, that's a very powerful position. And then the second thing is that they've crafted a very persuasive narrative that says when America has been on the side of this ideal, we flourished, and when we stepped away from this ideal, we floundered. And maybe you've heard some equivalent of this. In the post-war era, basically after World War II up into the 1970s, the United States fought inequality through unions, through high taxes on the rich, through a strong minimum wage. And what did we get? We got America's golden age. Then, in the late 70s, and particularly under Reagan, what happened? Well, we stopped doing that. We had a so-called laissez-faire revival. The 1% started rigging the system, and all the gains went to them, and the rest of us stagnated. Has everybody heard some form of that narrative? Certainly if you've listened to Bernie Sanders in the debates, that's kind of the story that he's telling, Paul Krugman's telling, Thomas Piketty is telling, Barack Obama has told. This is their kind of narrative that is really illustrating you need to follow our ideal or it's bad news. The American dream is dead. And what has been then the right's response? Well, as I mentioned briefly, it was silence. When it wasn't silence, it was quibbling over statistics. Inequality is not as bad as you guys are making it out to be. Or it's quibbling about means. Maybe you remember Rand Paul was asked in the presidential debates. He was asked, so what are you going to do about inequality? He says, if you care about economic inequality, then you should not vote for Democrats because their policies make economic inequality worse. All of these concede that economic equality is an ideal. And here's the problem with that if you are a champion of economic freedom. Whatever else you can say about a free society, it does not lead to equal outcomes. It does not lead to anything approaching economic equality. And why is that? I mean, do we all produce the same amount of wealth? Are we all as ambitious, intelligent? Do we all save and invest as much? No, people make all sorts of different choices and they have all sorts of different capacities. And as a result, we all create different amounts of wealth. And so if people are free to produce, trade, and keep what they earn, then you're going to get inequality. And so you need to challenge them. You need to challenge both the ideal and the narrative if you're going to have an impact. So our answer, I mean, again, it takes almost 250 pages for us to lay it out. So I just want to sketch for you how we think about the issue, and hopefully that'll encourage you to buy the book. But basically, the first step is you need to expose their ideal as immoral. And a key point here is that you can't be for equality. There's no such thing as I'm for equality, not across the board, because different aspects of equality, different kinds of equality conflict with one another. And basically there's one fundamental conflict, and that's between political equality and economic equality. So political equality is, guess what? Government treats everybody the same. You all have the same rights, and the government's going to protect your rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Man or woman, black or white, rich or poor. Well, if the government does that, no special favors for some people, no special regulations, restrictions, constraints for others. If it's treating everybody the same, that's when we get economic inequality. And so you have to make a choice. Either you're going to give special privileges to some and special burdens on others in the name of equalizing, or you're going to treat everybody equally and allow the results to be very, very different. So what's your choice going to be? And once they're taken, the mantle of being for equality is taken away from them, that alone puts them on the defensive, or at least it equalizes your moral standing in the debate, because it's a debate about what conception of equality is right, not one side's for equality and one side's against it. The second thing is to rewrite their narrative, because it turns out it's just completely bogus. It cannot withstand even 10 minutes of poking and prodding. And I'm not going to go into the details now, but I will mention that part of what you have to do then is not just poke holes. You have to have a counter narrative that explains how your view of things, your ideal, is actually the way to understand what's been happening historically. And what we argue is that we do have an inequality problem in America. We've had one for 75 years and longer. But it's not an economic inequality problem. It is a political inequality problem. The government hasn't been protecting our equal rights. Some people have been getting special privileges, and other people have been facing special burdens, restraints, constrictions, controls. So, for instance, cronyism. That is an instance of political inequality. It's that, hey, if you have political influence with somebody in Washington or somebody in your local government, you can get a subsidy, you can get a bailout. And if you don't, you can't. Or the welfare state. These are special privileges. It says, you work, I get your money. Instead of protecting our equal rights to production and property, it is you produce, and then I get the privilege of taking it. Or the whole regulatory state is some people get to dictate and restrict the voluntary choices of other people. And in the book, we go through just a lot of examples of the way in which this political inequality is what's actually been responsible for what really is a problem. So this sense that the system is becoming rigged, there's a reason why when Bernie Sanders says it, it resonates. It's because people have the sense that there is that thing going on where some insiders are getting away with everything and I'm finding my opportunity to achieve anything restricted. But it's precisely because the government has too much power to pick winners and losers, that we've gotten into this state. And so the solution is not, we'll give them even more power, but just say, use it against the 1% instead of allegedly for the 1%. And finally, you have to have a counter-ideal. You have to stand for something, not just oppose the crusade against economic inequality. And what we stand for, what we think Americans really care about, and what we think political equality protects and unleashes is opportunity. The opportunity to rise as far as your ambition and ability will take you. The opportunity to live as a producer and make of your life what you want through your own actions. So that's just at the broadest level, sketching out what we do in the book. The reaction, well, the book hasn't come out, but I was in an airport, I believe in Georgia, and I was sitting at a bar eating breakfast and had my bacon and eggs, and I had my early copy of the book that I was looking through to make sure they had all the corrections and whatnot. And the waitress came over to me and said, "Oh my gosh, what's that book?" And I said, "Well, it's my book." And she says, Can I get a copy? I said, "Well, it's for preview." And right in front of me, she gets all excited and she starts ordering it on Amazon on her phone. And then the person next to me goes, "What is that?" And then they start asking about it. And then the other guy, and what became clear very quickly is that people really are thirsty for somebody who's challenging this idea that we should all be equal, that there's something bad about some people being far more successful than others. And so I'm very excited to see about how this is going to play out in the days ahead and in the years ahead, because part of what I think is the right has basically viewed the inequality debate as how do we get away from that? And my view is how do you turn it into a winning issue? And I think the champions of free markets have to turn it into a winning issue, or it becomes a losing issue for us. There's no wash on this issue. Either we completely defeat the egalitarians, or we put them on the defensive, or they put us in the defensive. So that's really the alternative before us. And so what can you guys do if you're interested? I would say the first thing is, read the book. And if you don't want to buy it today, if you go to equalsunfair.com, as of Monday, the first chapter is going to be online for free. You can find a bunch of things that we've written and videos that we've done that are relevant to this. And so if you actually think, yeah, this sounds something that's interesting and valuable to me, the most helpful things you can do right now are A, pre-order and especially bulk order, and you can find information on that in Equals Unfair, because it becomes vitally important in order for a book to gain traction that in the first weeks it does really, really well. That's really what is going to get people to start talking about it and get that conversation started. And then the second thing is we have a lot of things that we are going to be doing to promote the book, but that requires funding. And so definitely talk to Yaron if you're interested in helping out there. And I do want to say, though, as far as we've come has been made possible by those of you who have already supported us. We thank you in the book for that, and I wanted to thank you personally for that, because certainly it's never very far from our minds that our work is made possible by that. And I think it's important work, because if you guys weren't doing that, there would not be an answer to the inequality campaign right now. It would not exist if it weren't for that. So thank you very much, and I think we might have a few minutes for questions, unless I went long. Yes?
Practical question. Does it matter whether we buy the book here or order it online in terms of the impact of the sales?
Not really. Well, if you're just... Okay. You'll just have to wait a couple weeks, so, all right.
We'll do both.
Yeah, that is the best way to help, so. Yes?
Have you seen the internet video about where they take the inequality thing, and it takes the graph, and it goes way high, and it says, what's the ideal?
Uh-huh.
And they cut the graph, say the ideal is like everyone's a little bit inequality, but not too much.
Uh-huh.
And they're showing that the actual inequality is way worse than the ideal, so we should have the government redistribute things.
I haven't seen that particular, I might have seen that particular video, but they have a lot.
All my friends are communists, so
You should get new friends.
better choice. When I came back to him saying, well, later I think about it. So, well, who says this ideal is right? And if you have an ideal, then what? So they impose that ideal from top down, which is basically what they're saying. Anyway, I just wondered if you saw that video, do you have a response?
So there is that kind of argument, right? Like they'll do these polls where they'll ask people, what's the ideal amount of inequality? And then they'll name some number. And then they'll say, well, it's way more than that, so shouldn't we fight inequality? And people go, oh, yeah. Well, but the whole approach is wrong. So the question, if you're going to evaluate something morally, is not what is the gap, but how did that gap occur? And if it occurred because people did something totally moral and just, then it's irrelevant what the difference in outcome is. So for instance, the inequality critics will often say something like this. If somebody came and dumped $300,000 on a table and you and two of your friends were there, how would you divide it up? Well, most of us say the fair way is to do it 100,000, 100,000, 100,000. Yeah, maybe, but is that really what a productive economy is? That money is dumped in our collective laps and we divide it up? No, the real analogy is 3 of us walk into a room. Do we have to empty out our wallets and divide it up fairly? Is that gap unfair? No, because if it's individuals creating different amounts, there's nothing suspicious about the difference. And so, yes, they're definitely cashing in on the fact that they're trying to get you to ignore how did those differences emerge? And that's really the fundamental question. The question is, did the differences emerge through production and voluntary trade, or did it emerge through some injustice? And if it emerged through an injustice, then the problem is the injustice, not the gap. Because if there's an injustice that makes us more equal, does that make it better? Bernie Madoff, actually, people have argued that he actually made things a little bit more equal, just the way in which his scam worked. But was that a good thing, or was it still a horrific injustice? And I say, it doesn't mitigate things at all to make them more equal. So those are really bogus arguments. But yeah, it's really hard to get people to care about gaps. So you have to come up with these really tricky, clever ways to do it. Yes?
I just had a quick question. I was just curious, those 3 facets that you mentioned about the book, the leverage and the opportunity. Did you find that you learned anything from the free market revolution that you did a little bit differently with this book? Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question was, did I learn anything between our first book together and this book together that changed the focus? Yeah, I mean, I think Free Market Revolution was, in fact, going back to it, it's better than I thought it was in my memory. But definitely there was a lot learned, and in particular, learned a lot more about being super sensitive to the context, not just of like, people have this, objection to capitalism, make sure you answer it, but getting much more sensitive to the whole way that they think about an issue. And if you can really see inside a person's mind and how they process it and their whole moral and intellectual framework, then you can be much more successful in answering it than if you just view it as kind of discrete objections to your view that you're answering. And so the last chapter before the epilogue of this book is called Understanding the Inequality Debate. And I think it's by far the best thing, certainly that I've ever written, but I think as a collaboration that we've ever written. And that really, it lays out the whole moral and intellectual and economic framework for how the egalitarians think about economic issues. And once that was super clear in my mind, and then once it was super clear in our minds about how like the average American who doesn't buy into that context thought about things, I think it makes the book 10,000 times more effective than it would otherwise be. And I don't feel that I had fully that clarity with Free Market Revolution. But so I think it shows up in a lot of subtleties more than it does in some big specific concrete thing I can give you. Like we learned, don't use. So I was at a CPAC, which is the big conservative conference, and they were strategizing on how to beat the left. And what they did is they took a bunch of polls on words, and they found out, people don't like individualism, so let's call it like excellence or something. So there was nothing like that where we said, all right, let's stop talking about capitalism and talk about like good economies, But there are a lot of subtleties that I think impacted, and since there's nobody around to praise the book except for me right now, I'll say it is by far the best thing that I've ever worked on. Yes.
We were recently having this discussion with our friend who's African American, and you mentioned injustice. So because of the injustice of slavery, his feeling is that it can never be an equal playing field. And I'm just wondering if you address that in the book, or if you have any comments on that, because it's difficult for us to continue that discussion when we go there.
Yeah, I want to write something more expansive on this. This book very much tries to delimit away from the issue of racial inequality, because I think that is something that you can't talk about briefly and treat it with the depth that it deserves. What I will say is this: the Inequality Alarmists purposefully and illegitimately package together the issue of racial inequality with economic inequality, and they're two separate issues. You can view that there have been severe, and I think you should view it, severe injustices and continue to be injustices against blacks in America. And it does have economic consequences, but that has nothing to do with, is economic inequality wrong? and Bernie Sanders is the worst at this because he's really tried to cash in off the injustices against blacks to make people care about the so-called injustices of people being really successful. If your solution to racial discrimination is take down Wall Street bankers, you're not honest about racial inequality. And so what I would say is I think they're separate issues and need to be kept separate, and the people trying to blend them are trying to do something illegitimate. So that's the briefest answer I can give to something that is important. I will say, though, that I think it's important as somebody who's for justice to be very aware and respectful of the fact that there is many injustices against people based on race even today, and that shouldn't be taken lightly. Yes?
Do you get into, okay, my biggest problem is that the government will make senators and representatives rich. And that is unfair for ethical reasons. And do you get into anything about how to fix that sort of thing?
I don't know exactly the kind of case that you have in mind. I mean, basically, what we have is a chapter where we try to make it fully clear of what are just economic transactions and outcomes and what are unjust ones. And unjust ones are going to be fundamentally ones that are coercive rather than voluntary. And so what we do is advocate a government that only engages in the protection of freedom, which means barring coercion, and that way the economic transactions are all going to be voluntary and therefore, in our view, just. And so if you're talking about politicians enriching themselves through politics, the major thing is that you need to get government out of having the power to dispense special favors and special privileges. When they have enormous political power over people's lives, then people will pay a lot of money to have that power used not to slit their throat, but to, unfortunately, either line their pockets or at least, in the best cases, just leave them alone. So it's really an issue of getting government to its proper function. There's no special problem, at least I don't think it's the biggest issue, of how do you keep politicians from getting rich. They're going to get rich so long as they have so much power. And them getting rich is the least objectionable part of having all that power.
But it all ties together.
Right, yeah.
And
Yeah, for sure.
I think that's why I want term limits. And
But yeah, you have my sympathies. It's particularly when you see good people struggling and then you see bad people lining their pockets. I mean, you can almost sympathize with the resentment of the inequality alarmists until you remind yourself that they're the ones creating that scenario. So, yes.
Question, they use clever words. One that I pushed back on a while, they talk about the percentage of national income. I've thought about this a bit. Of course, there is no national income. There's my income, your income. You can add them together, but it's irrelevant. And Sanders says this, and people actually been saying it for years. They talk about the percentage of national income that's going to the top. Well, the national income doesn't go anywhere.
Yes.
We get our own income. But they've set this up, and it's very clever. And people that don't really think about the issue, if they grab onto that, and it's deep. Do you push back on this in the book, or is, in other words, not setting up the terms of the argument?
Yeah, so I think if you didn't hear him, it's basically the way in which they use terminology that basically takes their viewpoint for granted without argument. So the whole idea of all the gains have gone to the rich. This is like their key stock phrase. And yes, in fact, we make it explicit in the book. This is one, at the very end of the book, we have what are the things you can do to be better at persuading people on this issue? And one of them is precisely you need to be very, very vigilant about your terminology. And in fact, we start out the book by showing precisely this point, the way in which they assume through bogus terminology their framework. And once you let them get away with that, then you've basically given your case away, because a lot of their plausibility just comes from those kind of bogus phrases, where if they came out and said, over the last 30 years, the rich have earned way more money than the rest of us. All right, tell us more. But of course they don't say that. Or if they came out and said, the 99% have not been earning enough money for themselves. Like, they need to do a lot better. Say, yeah, all right, well, good, we can agree in that. Or it's, cronies have been using political power and physical force to extract unearned, gains through the political system. All right, good. There's something we can agree on. But it's exactly by using that kind of bogus terminology. And yes, and that's one of the reasons why Ayn Rand's perspective is so critical, because you need a philosophic perspective to be consistently conceptualize these phenomenon from the proper perspective. That's something philosophy teaches you, is to be very critical about concepts and about language. And that's why, and I should say, I was critical of Thomas Sowell, his book being mostly statistics, and it is mostly statistics, but he's one of the better people about challenging their language too. And I think always if you find yourself repeating stock phrases, particularly from your opponents, you should stop yourself and question, because that's how they get away with a lot. So with that, I got to go, but I'll be around, and please, come up and ask questions or get books signed, anything else. So thank you guys.